The moment my mother stood up at my uncle's will reading, I knew she still believed she could rewrite what she had done to me. The lawyer had just opened the sealed folder. Rain traced thin lines down the glass walls of the conference room, and 20 stories below us, downtown Cincinnati looked cold and gray and far away. My mother rose so quickly her chair scraped hard against the floor. "That's not possible," she said. Not confused. Not heartbroken. Angry. Like the document in the lawyer's hand had insulted her personally. Across the table, I didn't move. I had imagined this moment before, more times than I would ever admit out loud. In some versions, I was shaking. In some versions, I finally said everything I had carried for 15 years. In some versions, she cried. But in real life, I just sat there with my hands folded in my lap, feeling something much quieter than anger. I felt tired. Tired in the way you only feel when someone has spent years pretending your pain was a misunderstanding. The attorney adjusted her glasses and looked at my mother with the same calm expression she had worn since the meeting began. "No, Mrs. Carter," she said. "I'm reading exactly what Mr. Bennett wrote." My mother turned toward me then. For the first time in 15 years, her face wasn't arranged into certainty. It was something else. Fear, maybe. Or disbelief. Because she had not come to that room expecting truth. She had come expecting money. She had come wearing pearls and practiced grief and the quiet confidence of a woman who still believed blood could erase history. But blood stopped meaning very much to me on the night she left me sitting on a porch with 2 trash bags and locked the front door behind me. My father was there that afternoon too, staring down at the polished table as if the grain in the wood might save him from looking at me. My older sister sat near the wall beside their attorney, rigid and pale, her purse clutched tightly in both hands. No one had expected the reading to go this way. Least of all my mother. And before I tell you what the lawyer said next, before I tell you what made my mother go completely white in front of everyone in that room, I need to take you back to the summer I turned 13. Because the worst night of my life did not begin with shouting. It began with one sentence at the dinner table. Then one look. Then one word. No. That was the first time I ever said it to my mother. And in our house, girls like me were not allowed to say no. My name is Emily Carter. I'm 28 years old. And 15 years ago, my parents decided they were done being mine. In our house, love had a hierarchy. I didn't understand that when I was little. Children rarely do. They just feel the difference long before they have the language to explain it. My sister Jessica was 2 years older than me, and from the moment she could walk into a room, people noticed her. She had my mother's blonde hair, the same bright laugh, the same easy confidence that made teachers smile before she even spoke. "Jessica's going to do big things," my mother would say whenever relatives visited. She said it proudly. Loud enough for everyone to hear. No one ever said that about me. I looked like my father's side of the family, dark hair, brown eyes, quiet voice. I was the kid who sat at the edge of conversations, the one teachers described as serious for her age. I didn't resent Jessica. Not then. I just assumed that some people were naturally easier to love. You notice these things in small ways first. Jessica's birthdays were events. Balloons, music, friends filling the house, cakes with elaborate frosting designs. My mother would spend days planning them. My birthdays were simpler. Dinner at home, a cake from the grocery store bakery, 4 candles instead of 13 because they all melt together anyway. I told myself it didn't matter. For a long time I believed that. But the truth started to reveal itself the year I turned 12. One afternoon I came home from school early because a teacher workshop had canceled our last class. When I walked into the kitchen, my parents were sitting at the table with papers spread out in front of them. They stopped talking when they saw me. That alone told me something was important. Jessica's name was written across the top of one document. "What's that?" I asked. My mother looked surprised. "Jessica's college account," she said. The way she said it made it sound like something everyone already knew about. I stood there for a moment, trying to make the information settle into place. "How long have you had that?" I asked. "Since she was 5, my father answered without looking up. 8 years. 8 years of saving for Jessica's future. A strange feeling moved through my chest. Do I have one? My mother blinked at me like the question hadn't occurred to her before. No, she said. Then she added something that would echo in my head for years. You're good at figuring things out, Emily. You'll find your own way. At 12, I nodded like that made sense. But that was the first moment I understood something about my family. Jessica had a plan. I had expectations. And 3 months later, the summer I turned 13, those expectations collided with something my mother had never prepared for. I stopped cooperating. By the way, before we go further, I'm curious, where are you listening from tonight? Some of you probably recognize this kind of family dynamic immediately. The quiet child, the golden one, the rules that only apply in one direction. And if you do, you already know that the breaking point rarely arrives all at once. It arrives slowly, right up until the moment someone finally says the one word that changes everything. No. The acceptance letter arrived on a Tuesday afternoon. I remember the day clearly because it was unusually hot for May, and the metal mailbox at the end of our driveway had warmed under the sun. When I pulled the envelope out, I noticed the return address first. Case Western Reserve University. For a second, I just stood there. 6 weeks earlier, I had quietly applied to something called the Ohio Summer Engineering Institute, a residential program for middle school students who showed unusual promise in math and science. The scholarship covered everything: tuition, housing, meals, lab access. I hadn't told anyone at home. Not because I was hiding it, because hope felt safer when it stayed private. I opened the envelope right there beside the mailbox. The first sentence began with congratulations. Out of hundreds of applicants across the state, 50 students had been selected. I was one of them. I read the letter 3 times before I even started walking back toward the house. For a few minutes, just a few, I let myself imagine what it would be like. Dorm rooms. Engineering labs. Students who loved the same things I loved. A place where asking questions wouldn't make people sigh. That afternoon was the first time in my life I felt something close to pride. I folded the letter carefully and slipped it inside my backpack. But secrets rarely survive long in families where privacy is treated like disrespect. Jessica found the envelope 2 days later. She had been looking for tape in my desk drawer when she pulled it out. At dinner that night, the letter appeared beside my mother's plate like evidence in a trial. So, my mother said calmly, tapping the paper with one finger, "You were planning to keep this from us?" My stomach tightened. I just didn't want to say anything until I knew. And now you know. Jessica leaned forward to read the letter. "It's like science camp, right?" "It's not camp," I said quietly. "It's a scholarship program." My mother ignored that. "Well," she said, "this creates a scheduling problem." I knew what she meant before she finished the sentence. Jessica had recently been invited to a performing arts intensive in Los Angeles. 3 weeks. No scholarship. Expensive. But in my mother's mind, it was important. Prestigious. Visible. "We can't support both programs," she said, "and Jessica's opportunity will help her college applications." I stared at the acceptance letter. "My scholarship covers everything." "That's not the point," my mother replied. Then she said the sentence that changed my life. "You'll decline the program. Not, can we discuss it? Not, would you consider waiting?" Just a decision already made. Something inside me, something that had been bending quietly for years, finally stopped bending. "No," I said. The word fell into the center of the table like a dropped glass. The room went completely silent. My mother looked at me slowly. "Excuse me?" My voice shook, but it didn't disappear. I said no. I earned this. And the moment those words left my mouth, something shifted in the air around us. Because in our house, daughters were allowed to disappoint quietly. But we were never supposed to disagree out loud. My mother did not raise her voice right away. That would have been easier to understand. Instead, she went very still. She folded her napkin beside her plate, sat back in her chair, and looked at me with the same calm expression she used when a cashier at the grocery store made a mistake with her change. Controlled. Measured. Dangerous. You earned this? She repeated. I nodded, even though my throat had tightened. Yes. Jessica gave a quiet laugh, the kind that wasn't openly cruel but still carried disbelief. Mom, she said, it's just a summer thing. My mother shook her head. No, it's not just a summer thing. It's about priorities. She turned back to me. Jessica's program will help her long term. Your engineering camp is a hobby. It's not a hobby, I said. Don't interrupt me. My father had been silent the entire time, staring down at his plate like he was hoping the conversation might dissolve if he refused to acknowledge it. Finally, he cleared his throat. Emily, he said quietly, your mother is trying to do what's best for the family. That sentence had worked on me for years. What's best for the family? It usually meant that someone had already decided whose future mattered more. My mother leaned forward slightly. If you care about this family, she said, you'll make a small sacrifice for your sister. A small sacrifice. 6 weeks. A scholarship I had earned. A chance to be somewhere that felt like mine. My hands were shaking under the table. For a moment, the old instinct returned. Apologize. Smooth it over. Give up the thing you want so everyone else can breathe again. But then I thought about the acceptance letter in my backpack. About the labs. About the students who had also worked hard enough to be there. And about the quiet voice inside me that had whispered for years that maybe, just maybe, I deserved something too. I'm going, I said softly. The sentence barely made it across the table. But my mother heard it. Her chair moved back as she stood. If that's your attitude, she said, her voice colder now, then perhaps you don't understand what family means. Jessica followed her upstairs a few seconds later, avoiding my eyes as she left the room. That left just my father and me at the table. He rubbed a hand over his face slowly. You should apologize, he said. I looked at him. What happens if I don't? He hesitated longer than I expected. Then he said something that would echo in my mind for years. Emily, don't make your mother choose. I sat there quietly after he left the room. Because something about that sentence felt wrong. Not because it was unfair, but because it revealed something deeper. My mother had already chosen. And somehow, everyone in the house understood that. Except me. For 3 days after that dinner, my mother barely spoke to me. Not yelling. Not punishing. Just silence. At 13, I thought that meant the worst had passed. I kept my head down, did my homework, stayed quiet at the table. I told myself the house would eventually return to its usual uneasy balance. It always had before. But this time, something felt different. On the first morning, my mother didn't pack my lunch. On the second day, she told my father and Jessica they were going out to dinner and left a $10 bill on the counter for me. On the third day, she moved around the house as if I were already gone. No instructions. No corrections. No eye contact. The absence of her attention felt colder than anger. That Friday I stayed late at the public library after school, pretending to read while the sun slowly moved across the windows. I didn't want to go home yet. I couldn't explain why, but something in my chest felt tight every time I thought about walking through the front door. Eventually, the library closed. I walked the 2 blocks back to our house just after 6. And that's when I saw the bags. 2 black trash bags sitting on the porch. My backpack leaned against them. My sneakers were placed neatly beside the steps. For a moment, my brain refused to understand what I was looking at. Then the front door opened. My mother stood in the doorway. She didn't look angry. She looked organized. I called your Uncle Daniel, she said. The words didn't make sense. Why? He'll be here to pick you up. I stared at her. Pick me up for what? You'll be staying with him for a while. A while. Like this was summer camp. Like this was temporary. My father stood behind her in the hallway. I could see him through the open door, his hands in his pockets, his eyes fixed somewhere near the floor. Dad? I said. He didn't answer. My mother crossed her arms. You made it clear that you don't want to cooperate with this family, she said calmly. Daniel can provide the structure you clearly need. I'm 13. The sentence came out small, even to my own ears. Her expression didn't change. That's exactly why this needs to happen. I asked if I could at least come inside while I waited. She said no. I asked if I could call my uncle myself. She said she had already handled it. Then she stepped backward and closed the door. Not slammed. Closed. I heard the lock click a second later. I sat down beside the trash bags and wrapped my arms around my knees. The sun went down slowly. The porch light never turned on. At one point, I looked up toward Jessica's bedroom window. The curtain moved. She was there, watching. But she never came outside. Uncle Daniel lived almost 2 hours away. It was nearly 10 when his truck finally turned onto our street. And by the time the headlights reached the driveway, I had already learned something that would take years to unlearn. A child can be left in the dark by the people who made her, and still somehow believe it must have been her fault. Uncle Daniel didn't ask questions on the porch. He stepped out of his truck, saw me sitting beside the trash bags, and stopped walking. Something in his face changed immediately. Not shock. Understanding. Emily, he said quietly. That was all it took for the tight feeling in my chest to finally break. I stood up too fast, my legs stiff from sitting so long, and before I could say anything, he wrapped his arms around me. Not carefully. Firmly. Like he had already decided I wasn't going anywhere else that night. What happened? He asked. I tried to answer, but the words tangled in my throat. The only sound that came out was something small and shaky that I didn't recognize as my own voice. He didn't push. Okay, he said gently. We'll talk later. Behind us, the front door opened. My mother stepped outside holding a manila envelope. My father stayed inside the hallway. He still wouldn't come all the way to the porch. There are guardianship documents, my mother said, handing the envelope toward Daniel. Her voice sounded calm, businesslike, like she was transferring ownership of something that had become inconvenient. Daniel didn't take the envelope immediately. He looked at her for a long moment. Temporary? He asked. That depends on Emily's behavior. The sentence made my stomach twist. As if sitting outside with my belongings had been the result of bad manners. Daniel finally took the envelope without another word. Then he picked up one of the trash bags and carried it to the truck. He didn't ask me to help. He didn't ask me to say goodbye. When I climbed into the passenger seat, I looked once toward the house. My mother had already gone back inside. The door closed again. No one came out after that. We drove for about 20 minutes before Daniel spoke. You hungry? I shook my head. He stopped at a diner anyway. Inside, the fluorescent lights were bright and warm. The waitress poured hot chocolate into a thick ceramic mug and set it in front of me without asking questions. Daniel ordered grilled cheese and tomato soup. Take your time, he said. I managed a few bites. Eventually he asked, what did they say happened? I stared down at the table. She said if I couldn't sacrifice for the family, I wasn't part of it. Daniel leaned back slowly. And what did you refuse? A scholarship program. He nodded once. So they threw out the kid with the scholarship. The plain way he said it nearly made me cry again. Because for the first time that night, someone had named what happened without trying to soften it. Around midnight, we pulled into his driveway outside Lebanon, Ohio. The house sat on a quiet piece of land, with a long porch and a workshop behind it. When he opened the front door, he looked back at me and said something that changed the direction of my life. You have a home here. Not for now. Not until you learn. Just here. A home. And when you've spent years trying to earn love in tiny pieces, unconditional words feel almost unreal. The first week at Uncle Daniel's house felt unreal. Not in some magical way. In the quiet way safety can feel strange when you've never had it before. The morning after I arrived, I woke up early because I was afraid I had overslept. In my parents' house, being late for anything meant lectures, sighs, and the kind of disappointment that filled the whole kitchen. But when I walked downstairs, Daniel was standing at the stove making scrambled eggs. He looked over his shoulder and smiled like this was the most normal morning in the world. "Good," he said. "You're awake. Sit down." I hesitated for a second. He noticed. "You don't have to ask permission to eat in this house," he added gently. That sentence alone felt like learning a new language. For the first few days, I moved carefully through everything. I folded blankets too neatly. I washed dishes immediately after using them. I apologized whenever I spoke too loudly. Daniel never laughed at that. He just stayed steady. He cleared out the guest room and told me it was mine now. We drove to a store in town so I could pick out notebooks and school supplies. He asked what subjects I liked, and listened carefully to my answers like they actually mattered. No one had ever done that before. The first night, he asked about the scholarship program. "You still planning to go?" he said. I looked down at the table. "I don't know if Mom will let me." Daniel leaned back in his chair. "Well," he said calmly, "your mother signed guardianship papers." I blinked. "So? So that means decisions about you come through me now." I stared at him. "You mean I can still go?" He gave a small shrug. "Of course you can." For a moment I couldn't speak, because until that second, I hadn't even allowed myself to hope the program might still happen. Daniel reached across the table and slid the acceptance letter toward me. "You worked hard for this," he said. And then he added something that would stay with me for years. "Other people's fear of your potential is not your responsibility. If you've ever had someone believe in you before you believed in yourself, you know how powerful that moment can be." That night, lying in the small bedroom at the end of the hallway, I realized something that had never felt true before. Maybe the story my parents wrote about me wasn't the only story I was allowed to live. The engineering program started 3 weeks later. For the first time in my life, I left home for something that felt like it belonged to me. The campus looked enormous to my 13-year-old eyes. Brick buildings, tall trees, students walking across wide green lawns carrying notebooks and laptops. Everything about the place felt bigger than the world I had known. But the strangest part wasn't the campus. It was the other kids. They were like me. Kids who asked too many questions. Kids who stayed up late solving problems because they actually liked the challenge. Kids who didn't roll their eyes when someone started talking about physics or coding or how bridges carried weight. For 6 weeks, I lived in dorms, worked in labs, and built a small robotic arm with 3 other students who argued passionately about gear ratios and battery efficiency. No one told me I was too serious. No one sighed when I asked another question. For the first time, I wasn't the quiet kid in the corner. I was just one of them. But the moment I understood something important about myself didn't happen in a classroom. It happened during a phone call with Uncle Daniel. Every Sunday evening, the program allowed students to call home. Most kids dialed their parents. I dialed Daniel. "How's it going?" he asked when he picked up. I hesitated for a moment. Then the words came out faster than I expected. I think I'm actually good at this." There was a pause on the line. Then Daniel laughed softly. "Emily," he said, "I already knew that. Sometimes people assume confidence grows from praise, but real confidence often grows from something quieter. Consistency." Daniel never treated my interests like a phase. He didn't act surprised when I succeeded. He simply expected me to. And slowly, that expectation became something I carried for myself. When the program ended in August, our team presented our final projects in a small auditorium filled with teachers, parents, and program staff. Daniel drove 2 hours to be there. I spotted him in the back row, wearing the same brown jacket he always wore to work. When our presentation ended, he was the first one standing. Clapping. Not politely. Proudly. Afterward, while we walked across the campus parking lot, he said something I didn't fully understand until years later. "You know," he said, "people sometimes confuse comfort with love." I looked at him. "What do you mean?" He opened the truck door for me. "Some families love the version of you that stays small," he said. The moment you grow, they call it rebellion. He didn't say anything else after that. But the sentence stayed with me. Because the truth was, my life had already started growing beyond the space my parents had prepared for it, and they had made it very clear how they felt about that. When the summer program ended, I expected life to slow down again. I thought I would return to Daniel's house, go to school, keep my head down, and quietly build whatever future I could from there. But something inside me had already shifted. For 6 weeks, I had lived in a place where curiosity wasn't treated like a problem, where asking questions didn't make people impatient, where intelligence wasn't something you apologized for. Coming back from that kind of environment changes you, even if you're only 13. The first day of school that fall felt different too. Daniel had transferred my enrollment to the local district near his house. The building was smaller than my old school, but the teachers seemed less distracted, less rushed. In my math class, the teacher handed back our first assignment with a note written in blue pen across the top of my page. You should consider advanced placement next year. I stared at the sentence for a long time. No one had ever suggested that before. Not because I wasn't capable, because no one had really looked. When I showed the paper to Daniel that evening, he nodded like the idea made perfect sense. Good, he said. That's it? I asked. What were you expecting? I don't know. Something bigger. He smiled a little. Emily, success doesn't have to be loud to be real. That became the rhythm of life in his house. Quiet encouragement. Practical conversations. Steady support that never turned into pressure. He taught me small things that mattered more than he probably realized. How to manage money. How to read contracts. How to ask questions in meetings instead of pretending to understand something you didn't. Daniel owned several commercial properties around Cincinnati. Nothing flashy office buildings, small warehouses, a few retail spaces, but he ran everything carefully. Sometimes on weekends, he took me with him to check on tenants or review maintenance work. I liked those trips. He treated business like a puzzle. Every building tells a story, he told me once while we stood in an empty office space waiting for a contractor. What kind of story? About decisions, he said. Good ones and bad ones. I didn't realize then how much those afternoons were shaping my future. At 13, I was just happy to be somewhere that felt steady, somewhere that felt safe. For the first time in my life, I wasn't trying to prove I deserved to exist. I was just living. And slowly, year by year, the girl who had been left on a porch with 2 trash bags began to disappear. In her place, someone new was growing. Someone my parents would not have recognized anymore. And that was exactly the point. High school passed in the kind of quiet rhythm that only becomes meaningful when you look back on it years later. At the time, it just felt like work. Homework at the kitchen table, math competitions on Saturdays, late nights studying while the house stayed calm around me. Daniel never pushed, but he always noticed. When I brought home a test with a high score, he nodded like that result had been inevitable. When I struggled with something, he sat across from me with a notebook and helped me break the problem into smaller pieces. Big problems, he once said, drawing lines across the page, are usually just small problems pretending to be complicated. I used that advice for math. Later, I used it for life. By the time I was 17, things had changed more than I realized. I was captain of the math team. I had a 4 gigapascals. Teachers were talking about college scholarships and internships and programs I had never even heard of when I lived in my parents' house. Sometimes I wondered if my mother ever thought about me. Not in a hopeful way. Just in the way you sometimes think about a closed door and wonder if anyone on the other side remembers locking it. But she never called. Neither did my father. Jessica mailed one thing during those years. A wedding invitation when I was 21. No note. No explanation. Just a card with elegant lettering and the name of a man I had never met. I didn't go. I didn't respond. Not because I was angry, because by then, my life had grown too large to keep orbiting around people who had already decided they didn't want me in it. When I graduated high school as valedictorian, Daniel sat in the front row of the auditorium. When my name was announced, he stood before anyone else did, clapping the same way he had at the engineering program years earlier. Not politely, proudly. That night after the ceremony, we sat on the porch behind his house, while the sun disappeared behind the trees. "So," he said, handing me a glass of lemonade, "what's next?" "College," I said. "Good plan." I looked over at him. "You always say things like you already knew." He smiled a little. I did. That was Daniel. He never acted surprised when I succeeded. He just made sure I had the space to try. And by the time I turned 26, the small property company he had built had grown into something much bigger. Something I was now helping run. But success has a strange way of traveling. Eventually, it reaches people who once ignored you. And 15 years after my parents left me on that porch, they suddenly remembered my name. The phone call came on a Tuesday afternoon. I was in my office reviewing tenant reports when my phone buzzed with a number from Columbus. For a second, I almost ignored it. Numbers from that area code rarely meant anything good. But curiosity is a strange thing. Sometimes it answers before your judgment has time to stop it. "Hello?" There was a small pause. Then a voice I hadn't heard in 15 years said my name. Emily. My mother's voice had not changed. Still controlled, still confident, still carrying the faint tone of someone who expected the world to arrange itself around her decisions. "I heard about Daniel," she said. "I'm sorry for your loss." "Not Uncle Daniel. Just Daniel." I leaned back in my chair and looked out the office window. The parking lot below was full of tenants coming and going, ordinary life continuing like nothing had happened. "Thank you," I said. Another pause. "I assume there will be a formal reading of the will," she continued. There it was. The real reason for the call. Grief had barely finished entering the conversation before money followed it through the door. "Yes," I said. "Well," she replied smoothly, "your father and I feel we should be present. After all, Daniel was family." Family? That word sounded strange coming from her. For 15 years, she had managed to live without using it in connection with me. "How did you hear about the will reading?" I asked. Our attorney made a few calls. Of course he had. I imagined her sitting somewhere in Columbus, already confident about how the story would unfold. In her mind, she was still Daniel's sister-in-law. Still part of the family structure that entitled her to whatever came next. "Emily," she said after a moment, "I hope you're not still holding on to old misunderstandings." Old misunderstandings. The phrase hung between us like something rehearsed. I closed my eyes briefly. "No," I said calmly. "I'm not." Because misunderstanding wasn't the right word for what had happened 15 years earlier. Some of you listening probably know that difference. Misunderstandings happen between people who both want the truth. What happened to me was a decision. And now, 15 years later, the consequences of that decision were about to walk into a conference room. My mother thought she was coming to claim something. She had no idea she was about to meet the truth instead. The will reading was scheduled for Friday afternoon, 3 days after my mother's phone call. Rebecca Lawson, Daniel's estate attorney, asked me to come to her office the next morning. Her firm occupied the top floor of a quiet downtown building, the kind of place where everything felt deliberately calm. Thick carpet, tall windows, shelves of legal books that had probably never been moved. She waited until the door closed before speaking. "Your parents have filed a preliminary challenge," she said, sliding a document across the desk. I skimmed the first page. The words felt familiar in the worst possible way. Undue influence. According to the filing, I had isolated Daniel during his illness and pressured him to change his estate plan in my favor. I almost laughed. Not because it was funny, because it was predictable. "They don't necessarily expect to win," Rebecca continued. "This type of claim can delay estate transfers for over a year. Their strategy may simply be to create pressure for a settlement. In other words, pay them to go away." I leaned back in the chair. Daniel expected this, didn't he? Rebecca studied me for a moment. Yes. Then she reached into a drawer and pulled out a thin file folder. He left instructions for what to do if a challenge came from your parents. She opened the folder carefully and slid the first document toward me. The title read, Voluntary Relinquishment of Parental Rights. The date was 15 years old. My mother's signature sat at the bottom. So did my father's. For a moment the room felt very quiet. I didn't know they signed anything, I said slowly. Rebecca nodded. You were 13. Daniel believed you shouldn't carry that burden. The document transferred full guardianship of me to Daniel. Legally. Permanently. The night I had sat on that porch with 2 trash bags, my parents hadn't just thrown me out. They had signed papers making sure I no longer belonged to them. I stared at the signatures. The loops in my mother's handwriting were unmistakable. For 15 years, she had spoken about that night like it was a temporary arrangement. A misunderstanding. But the law remembered something different. Rebecca closed the folder. If we proceed with the will reading publicly, she said, this document becomes part of the official record. I nodded slowly. Because suddenly, something Daniel had told me during his illness made perfect sense. Let the truth do the work. And in 3 days, the truth was about to walk into that room with us. Friday arrived with rain. Not a storm, just that steady gray drizzle that makes the city feel quieter than usual. I reached Rebecca Lawson's office 15 minutes early. Daniel had taught me that if something important was about to happen, you should always arrive before the room fills with other people's energy. It gives you a moment to breathe, to think, to remember why you're there. The conference room overlooked the river. Floor-to-ceiling windows, a long walnut table, 12 leather chairs, arranged with careful symmetry. When I stepped inside, a few people were already seated. 2 representatives from charities Daniel had supported for years. Our company's senior accountant. The property operations manager who had worked with Daniel longer than I had known him. They all nodded quietly when they saw me. Not with pity. With respect. That mattered more than I expected. Rebecca sat at the head of the table reviewing documents. When she saw me, she gave a small, reassuring nod toward the seat beside her. You ready? She asked. I thought about the girl who had sat on a porch 15 years earlier. The girl who believed everything happening to her must somehow be her fault. I am, I said. At 2:03 p.m., the elevator doors opened down the hallway. My mother walked in first. Black dress. Pearl necklace. Carefully arranged grief. Behind her came my father, shoulders slightly hunched the way I remembered from years ago. Jessica followed beside him, her eyes scanning the room with the quiet tension of someone who wasn't entirely sure what she had agreed to attend. And then their attorney. Tall, polished, confident. The kind of confidence people often have when they believe the ending of a story has already been written. My mother spotted me immediately. For a brief moment, something flickered across her face. Not warmth. Not regret. Calculation. She stepped into the room like she still belonged at the center of it. I think there must be a mistake, she said, glancing at the seating arrangement. We should be sitting at the table. Rebecca didn't look up from her papers. Seats along the wall have been reserved for attending parties. My mother's smile tightened. But we're family. Rebecca finally lifted her gaze. The beneficiaries are seated at the table. Silence filled the room. My mother slowly turned her head toward me, because in that moment, she understood something she hadn't expected when she walked through that door. She hadn't come here as family. She had come here as a visitor. And the reading hadn't even started yet. Rebecca waited until everyone had taken their seats before she began. The rain tapped softly against the tall windows behind her. The sound was steady, almost calming, but inside the room the tension felt heavy enough to press against the walls. She opened a thick folder and adjusted her glasses. This is the last will and testament of Daniel Bennett, she said. Her voice was calm and precise. The kind of voice that doesn't rush. My mother sat perfectly straight in her chair along the wall. Her hands rested in her lap, fingers intertwined. pearls catching the overhead light. She looked composed again now, the way she always did when she believed control might still be recovered. The first few minutes were routine. Daniel's full legal name, date of execution, verification of sound mind, asset summary, commercial properties, investment accounts, cash reserves. The numbers were large enough to make Jessica shift slightly in her chair. I saw my mother lean toward their attorney and whisper something. He nodded once, confident. They still believed this was going to end in their favor. Then Rebecca turned a page. "We will now proceed to Article 5, she said. "This section addresses exclusions and family standing in relation to the estate." My mother's attention sharpened. Rebecca continued reading. On August 3rd, 15 years ago, Laura and Michael Carter voluntarily relinquished all parental rights and legal guardianship of their minor daughter, Emily Carter. The room went completely still, transferring full legal responsibility to Daniel Bennett. My mother stood so abruptly her chair tipped slightly backward. "That is not relevant," she said sharply. Rebecca didn't look up. "It is part of the legal record. That document was temporary." Rebecca lifted a single page from the folder. "The language does not describe it as temporary." My father stared down at the floor. Jessica's eyes moved slowly toward me. And suddenly the story my mother had told herself for 15 years, the story where I had abandoned the family, the story where she had been the reasonable one, started collapsing piece by piece inside that quiet conference room. Rebecca turned another page. "There is also an additional legal matter relevant to the estate," she said. She looked directly at my parents for the first time. 2 years after the guardianship transfer, Daniel Bennett completed a legal adoption. She paused. "Then read the next line clearly. Emily Carter became Emily Bennett under the law." For the first time that afternoon, my mother's composure cracked. Because the truth she had ignored for 15 years had just become impossible to deny. Legally, publicly, permanently, the word adoption seemed to hang in the air longer than any other sentence that afternoon. For a moment, no one moved. My mother blinked slowly, as if she hadn't heard the word correctly. "Adoption?" she repeated. Rebecca nodded calmly. "Yes, the adoption was finalized 2 years after the guardianship transfer. All legal requirements were satisfied. Because parental rights had already been relinquished, no additional consent was required." My father finally looked up. His face had gone pale. That's not possible," he said quietly. Rebecca slid a certified copy of the court document across the table. "The court record says otherwise." Jessica leaned forward to read the page. I watched her eyes move across the lines, watched the moment recognition arrived. Her shoulders lowered slightly. My mother, however, remained standing. "This is ridiculous," she said. "Daniel knew we were still her parents." Rebecca's voice didn't change. "Legally, you are not." Silence spread across the room again. But this silence felt different. Before, it had been tension. Now it felt like gravity. The weight of 15 years of decisions settling exactly where they belonged. My mother slowly turned toward me. "You let him do this?" she said. The question carried the same tone she used when I was a child, like my life was something she had always been entitled to manage. I met her eyes calmly. "He asked me," I said. That seemed to confuse her more than anything else that had happened. Because my mother had never imagined a version of the story where I was given a choice. Rebecca turned another page in the will. "Article 7, she continued. "This section identifies the primary beneficiary of the estate." My mother sat down slowly now, her confidence slipping further with every sentence. The attorney beside her had stopped writing notes. He already understood what was coming. Rebecca read the next line clearly. "I leave the entirety of my estate to my daughter, Emily Bennett." No one spoke. Not my father. Not Jessica. Not even my mother. And for the first time since the meeting began, the room felt completely honest. Because the story my parents had arrived believing, the story where they were still part of my life, had just ended. Right there. In one sentence. For several seconds after Rebecca finished reading the sentence, the room stayed completely silent. Not the tense silence from earlier. This one felt final. My mother stared at the table like the words might rearrange themselves if she waited long enough. "My daughter?" she repeated quietly, almost to herself. Rebecca closed the folder gently. "Yes," she said. "That is the language Mr. Bennett used." My mother's head snapped up. "That's manipulation," she said sharply, pointing toward me. She turned him against his own family. It was the first time that afternoon she had raised her voice. The attorney beside her shifted uncomfortably, but didn't interrupt, because even he knew the argument had already collapsed. Rebecca folded her hands. "The court documents show the adoption was completed legally 12 years ago," she said, "long before Mr. Bennett's illness." That sentence removed the last piece of ground my mother had been standing on. My father looked smaller somehow, like a man realizing the version of events he had quietly allowed for years was no longer sustainable. Jessica kept her eyes down. My mother turned toward me again. Her voice changed this time. Softer, almost pleading. "Emily, sweetheart, we can talk about this." The word sweetheart felt strange coming from her mouth. 15 years earlier, she had watched me sit on a porch in the dark without once using it. "You're still our daughter," she continued. "Nothing changes that." I stood slowly. Not because I was angry. Because I wanted her to see my face clearly when I answered. "You ended that relationship 15 years ago," I said calmly. Her expression tightened. "That's not true. You signed the papers." For the first time, she had no immediate reply. The truth doesn't always need dramatic delivery. Sometimes it only needs to be said once. I gathered the folder Rebecca had placed in front of me. "My life didn't end that night," I continued. "It just started somewhere else." Across the room, one of Daniel's longtime business partners nodded quietly. Not in agreement with me. In recognition of the truth. And that, more than anything else that afternoon, made the moment feel complete. After that, the meeting began to dissolve. Not dramatically. Quietly. Chairs shifted. Papers were gathered. The sound of rain against the windows grew louder now that no one was speaking over it. Rebecca continued reading the remaining sections of the will, charitable donations, property transfers, a few personal items left to longtime employees and friends. Daniel had thought about everything. That didn't surprise me. What surprised me was how calm I felt. For years, I had imagined confronting my parents again. I thought there would be anger waiting inside me, something sharp enough to finally say all the things I never said at 13. But anger wasn't there. Just distance. When Rebecca finished the final paragraph, she closed the folder and looked at me. "The reading is complete." One of Daniel's business partners reached across the table and shook my hand. "He'd be proud of you," he said quietly. I nodded. Across the room, my parents stood slowly. My father walked toward the door first, his shoulders slightly hunched, like he had aged 10 years in a single afternoon. Jessica followed him, but my mother stayed where she was. Of course she did. Control had always been difficult for her to release. She stepped closer to the table. "Emily," she said again. This time there was no performance in her voice, just uncertainty. "We made mistakes," she said. The sentence hovered between us. Not quite an apology. Not quite accountability. I studied her face for a moment. Then I answered carefully. "I already forgave you." Relief flashed across her expression. But I wasn't finished. "I forgave you for my sake," I continued. "Not so things could go back to the way they were." Her face fell. Some of you listening probably understand that difference. Forgiveness closes wounds. It doesn't reopen doors. My mother stood there a moment longer, searching for something else to say. But there wasn't anything left. Eventually, she turned and walked out of the room. And for the first time since I was 13 years old, I didn't feel like I was the one being left behind. The conference room emptied slowly after that. People spoke in quiet voices. Chairs slid back across the floor. Someone near the door murmured something about paperwork and next steps. Rebecca gathered the documents into a neat stack like this had been just another professional afternoon. But for me, the air felt different. Lighter. Not because I had won something. Because the truth had finally been spoken in a room full of witnesses. Daniel's accountant came over first. He had worked with Daniel for more than 20 years, and his handshake carried the calm steadiness of someone who had seen a lot of complicated families over the course of his career. "Your uncle believed in you," he said. I nodded. "I know." Another colleague stopped beside me. "He talked about you all the time," she added with a small smile. "Usually when the rest of us were complaining about spreadsheets." That made me laugh softly. Daniel had done that, often turning ordinary conversations into quiet opportunities to say something kind about me when I wasn't around. It struck me then that reputation travels farther than we realize. Not just the reputation our families give us, but the one we build for ourselves. After most of the room had cleared, Rebecca approached the table again. "There will be some administrative steps over the next few weeks," she said. "But the estate transfer should move quickly now that the challenge has effectively collapsed." Collapsed felt like the right word. My parents hadn't lost because I fought them. They lost because the truth had been waiting for them. Rebecca studied me for a moment. "You handled that well," she said. "I learned from Daniel." She smiled faintly. "That's obvious." As I gathered my things, I glanced toward the door where my parents had disappeared earlier. For a long time, I had imagined closure as something dramatic. A confrontation. An apology. A final moment where everyone understood everything. But closure rarely looks like that. Sometimes it's quieter. Sometimes it's just realizing that the chapter ended long ago, and you're the only one who kept reading. A week after the will reading, the legal challenge quietly disappeared. There was no dramatic confrontation. No final argument. No courtroom moment where someone admitted they were wrong. Just a short legal notice filed by my parents' attorney. The wording was careful and technical, withdrawn without further action. But the meaning was simple. They knew the truth had already won. Rebecca forwarded the document to me early that morning. The email contained only one sentence. "Daniel planned well." I stared at that line longer than I expected. Because the truth was, Daniel hadn't just planned. He had protected me. Long before I understood I might need protecting. The weeks that followed were filled with practical work, transferring titles, meeting with accountants, reviewing leases, stepping more fully into the business Daniel had spent 40 years building. None of it felt overwhelming. That surprised some people. But Daniel had been teaching me the business for years, quietly, patiently, long before anyone imagined I might someday run it. He never rushed the lessons. He simply trusted that I would grow into them. And eventually, I did. Then one evening, about 3 weeks after the will reading, an email appeared in my inbox. The sender's name made my chest tighten instantly. My mother. The subject line read, "Please read." The message itself was long. She wrote about difficult years, about financial stress, about how parenting sometimes meant making impossible choices. She said she regretted how things had unfolded. But as I read the message a second time, something became painfully clear. She never once described what had actually happened. Not the porch. Not the trash bags. Not the papers she signed that night. Only explanations. Only distance. Only the careful language people use when they want forgiveness without accountability. I closed the email and leaned back in my chair. For years, a part of me had wondered what I would do if my mother ever reached out. I had imagined anger or sadness, but what I felt instead was something much simpler. Clarity. So I wrote a reply. 4 sentences. "I read your message. I forgave what happened a long time ago. But I don't want a relationship. Please don't contact me again." When I pressed send, I expected guilt to arrive. But it didn't. Instead, something quiet settled inside me. Because sometimes the most powerful boundary you ever set is simply the one that finally protects your peace. A year after the will reading, I stood outside the first building Daniel had ever purchased. It wasn't the biggest property we owned. It wasn't even the most profitable. But it was where everything had started for him. A small brick office building on a quiet street just outside downtown Cincinnati. That morning, we installed a bronze plaque beside the entrance. Nothing flashy. Daniel would have hated that. Just a simple inscription. Daniel Bennett. 1954. 2025. He built places where people could stand. I ran my fingers across the engraved letters and felt the cool metal beneath my hand. For a moment, I imagined Daniel standing beside me the way he used to, hands in his jacket pockets, quietly observing everything without needing to say much. The business had grown since he passed. Not dramatically. Daniel never believed in dramatic growth. But steadily, carefully, exactly the way he taught me. We had expanded the scholarship program too. Every summer now, students from difficult homes received the same kind of opportunity that changed my life at 13, a chance to attend academic programs they otherwise could never afford. 5 students that first year. 8 the next. And every time I read their applications, I saw pieces of the girl I used to be. The girl who once believed being left behind meant she wasn't worth staying for. Jessica and I spoke occasionally now. Carefully. Respectfully. We never pretended the past had been different than it was. But honesty has a way of making small bridges possible. My parents never contacted me again. And for the first time in my life, their silence didn't feel like rejection. It felt like peace. Sometimes people expect stories like mine to end with revenge. Or victory. But the truth is quieter than that. The real victory came much earlier. The day a man who wasn't required to love me chose to anyway. Daniel didn't just give me a home. He gave me something far more powerful. A new beginning. And if you take anything from this story, I hope it's this. Your life doesn't begin when the people who hurt you finally admit they were wrong. Your life begins the moment you stop waiting for them to. If this story meant something to you, subscribe and stand for dignity. Because quiet strength deserves to be heard. And somewhere out there tonight, someone else is still sitting on a porch, wondering if their story will ever change. The truth is, it can.